I'm going to share the screen, and yeah, I've been. It's been suggested I take about 15 minutes with a few perspectives, and then open it up for another 15 minutes of conversation or questions. So let me see if I can get this here. And one thing that's so interesting to me joining in on this call from the beginning is we didn't really coordinate very much at all. I really wasn't sure what was going to happen before, or a whole lot of sense of what, you know, maybe I would be helpful to include. But I'm finding it pretty attuned and aligned. Because when we talk about, you know, eco-anxiety and all the forms of distress that can arise from everything that's been talked about, not just climate change, which is of course complex and enormous, but what we've acknowledged around the war and dealing with COVID, that it cannot just be, okay, let's do a few breathing practices and settle down, which believe me, I use and also recommend, but that we're really talking about connecting or remembering, reconnecting to levels of our humanity, levels of ourself that can get lost in the intensity of life and the enormity of what many of us are dealing with in just an ongoing way. So it's not just a, you know, calm down and then keep plugging ahead. It's noticing what arises when we do pause. And I want to really acknowledge how this world that we're living in right now is presenting levels of experience that we don't even have a language for yet. And I put these two up here. You know, they're not the common things you hear like eco-anxiety and eco-grief, environmental grief. But I appreciate these because it's an expression of attempting to articulate some of these vague, uncomfortable, how do I even talk about this feelings? So the first one, empathetic blench, don't care so much about the title itself, but it's that visceral reaction we can have of receiving something from someone, let's say a gift from someone that's also fraught with consequences. So maybe it's somebody who really loves you, cares about you, you care about them, and they give you this gift that's wrapped in plastic or lots of unnecessary paper, or maybe it's not very environmentally friendly. And there's these layers of conflicting emotions, appreciating their sentiment, their generosity, their expression of care for you, layered with all these things that sort of rub the other way against the values or the direction of your life. Or blissonance is enjoying a beautiful sunset, you know, and it's particularly colorful. And there's something about beauty that, you know, calls something up in us. But we know enough about air pollution and climate change to know that the reason it's so colorful is because of unhealthy particulates in the air, maybe from a nearby wildfire and the additional smoke, and all the things that we may understand about that in terms of consequences to the area, so that this moment stretches out into the future and into the past as well as the present. And that there are collective, these are not only individual experiences, but there's beginning to be rippling out these collective experiences like this that are sort of disenfranchised in the sense that, again, we often don't even have the language to talk about it. And I want to just kind of put our emotional landscape in a little bit of a context. at least in the predominant Western society and culture, there's a lot of emphasis on our rational, analytical selves. You know, and we like to think of ourselves as rational and controlled decision makers. And sometimes that's true. But what is more true is that our emotional, often less conscious parts of our brains are the ones that take hold of the reins or the steering wheel. They've been around in us longer. We're not even aware that it's because of emotional overwhelm or upset or unexamined beliefs that are driving our experiences and behaviors much more than thinking that we've thought it out and we're conscious and rational in the choices that we're making. And in fact, our brains and our hearts aren't very well equipped for the kind of uncertainty, risk levels, threats that are becoming part of our ambient reality. That information overload, especially if it has worry, distress, you know, literally kicks part of our brains offline, is what ends up happening. And it's more difficult to stay connected to the parts of ourselves that might be most useful in our work and in our relationships and our way of moving forward. So one of the things we can do, and it's already been happening this morning, is to gain more understanding and more skills for working with these other parts. I wanted to just shine a light for a moment on one of what are called our negative, our cognitive biases. And what this means is that our evolutionary psychology, the way that our brains and our nervous system has evolved to keep us alive, to keep us surviving, is to be very tuned into threats and risks and danger. And the problem is that because that is a sensitized area, it registers distress and negativity in us 3 to 5 times greater than it does neutral or positive events. Now, this is always a tricky thing, I think, to present, especially around climate change, because I am not in any way suggesting that we aren't facing truly potentially devastating, and we're on a very severe trajectory. So I'm not diminishing what we all need to deal with. What I am saying is that it requires a little more work for us to include in our awareness the things that are working well, the relationships that are strong, the progress that is being made, the buoyancy and emotional resiliency that's available to us, because it's very easy for these other things to sort of fill the screen internally. A lot of the study on this came actually out of relationship work, where couples or other kinds of relationships as well, if there was a conflict or a difficult situation, it wasn't balanced out to net zero with a positive experience and a positive interaction. It took 3 to 5 times the pleasant, positive, strengthening experiences to even out the one that we call negative or difficult or stressful in some way. So, and that's why if you've experienced therapy, things like doing a gratitude journal or taking time out to be with those things that are beautiful and thriving, require a little more of our effort to stay connected to our wholeness. So Daniel, when he was starting us out and talking about his experience of having a hard time focusing at work and the feeling of overwhelm, this is a quick little way to understand kind of what's happening when it comes to our brain and our nervous system. So this drawing, this graph, those two parallel lines, in between there is what's called our window of tolerance or our zone of resilience. And the idea is that we've got a lot on our plate. We've got things to get done. We've got people to take care of. We've got responsibilities. We've got all the things we've got going. And most of the time, we can handle it pretty well. But if there's just too much, or the stresses are too severe, and we move outside of that zone of resilience, if we move above what's represented there as the line, is when we get into that irritability, lashing out, knee-jerk reaction, pushing people away. And if we drop below it, it looks often more like numbing out, dissociating, just this kind of withdrawing into this isolated place. So what we can do is to bring more conscious awareness to where our edges are, and then to use some of these tools that we've been doing today. And I'll, if we have time, add a few more to bring us back into that zone of resilience. And if we don't do it consciously, we do it unconsciously, right? We push things away, we push people away, we just stop working. But it's not coming from that place of, let me make these choices about how and when it might be best to do that. Our brains just kick us offline. One thing really hopeful that's good to know about this window of tolerance is that it's not static. It stretches and it shrinks. The kinds of things that can shrink it can be as practical as not getting good sleep for 3, 4, 5 days in a row. Just think about that. If you've ever had a time of experiencing that, you don't want to talk to anybody for a while. There's just less of you available. The kinds of things that can stretch it are some of the mindfulness practices, even that we've touched on a little bit today, of how to reset your nervous system, do the butterfly hug, anything like that. There are many, many, many kinds. And the other thing to be aware of is the notion of toggling. And to think of it really more of a flow than a switch, a toggle switch, is to be with the things that are difficult and grow your capacity to be present to all the things we've been touching on today. But then coming back, ways to nourish ourselves, ways to reset, ways to step back. I have found, I do a lot of work with different nonprofits and advocacy organizations, and I believe it's changing, but there's been some beliefs that, it's kind of a waste of time to do, breathing practices, yoga, whatever, because there's so much to do. It's really urgent and there's not a moment to waste. But what happens if we don't have this other part of attending to ourselves, attending to our emotional landscapes, is that there's a high level of burnout. And I like to look at this because athletes and athletic training has gotten this message. If Olympic athletes are not hitting their fitness goals, one of the first things that coaches look to is, are they using their recovery time well? And recovery time is not considered taking a break from training. It's considered integral to training. That strength often happens when your muscles are resting after having had an extensive workout and a push. And that applies not just muscularly, but to the emotional and mental focus as well. And it certainly applies to the kinds of work that we're all engaged in here. So this is just saying it again, that when it comes to emotions and experiences of our inner landscape, we kind of have it backwards. You know, there's this belief that if we allow space for our sadness, for our frustration, for our anger, not only is it a waste of time, it might be dangerous. What if I fall into this pit of despair and can't crawl out? What if I just get so angry, that's it? But it's just the opposite that's true. And you might have felt this morning when we took time with sharing our tears, is that things start to flow. Things start to shift and move. And if we try and push down our feelings or press them aside, I like to say it's like having this big ball that you're trying to hold underwater. All it wants to do is pop up, and it's eventually going to win because your arm's going to get fatigued anyway. And that's what it's like with our feelings. If we don't find a healthy outlet, they're going to come out sideways. And you're going to snap at somebody, or you're going to check out or harm yourself potentially in the ways you need to withdraw. So it's not that there's unhealthy feelings and healthy feelings. There are feelings that flow. And if you care and are paying attention to what's happening in our world, and I know you wouldn't be on this call if that didn't include you, there are going to be just times when you have those big, deep, complex feelings, because those are natural expressions, human expressions of care and empathy. So to have this, let's do what we can, action-oriented thing, along with taking time for ourselves, is not, it's really moving us back into a more natural rhythm. Because think about it, you know, there's a waxing and a waning to the moon. There's an ebb and flow to the tides. There's an inhalation and an exhalation to the breath. There's a turning of the seasons where some are active and some are dormant. That really what we're inviting and reminding us is to move more in alignment with our place in the natural world by incorporating these kinds of perspectives and practices. And to go back a little bit to the, this is not, you know, keep calm and carry on. We not only need to grow our capacities in our ability to be creative, envisioning, hopeful, consider what may be possible, but we need to grow our tolerance for the difficult feelings. That if we feel ambivalence, shame, anxiety, guilt in navigating this complicated world, that rather than not having the capacity to tolerate it, and again, removing ourselves in some way, numbing out, pushing it aside, it's okay to be with these feelings, to tolerate this array of things that we're going to experience. You might think of our feelings as sort of like the palette, the paints of life. You know, they give it hues and colors and textures, and that we can become more friendly with these parts of our experiences. If you know this name, Caroline Hickman, she's one of the people who did a very big study, I'm sure you're aware of, came out, I think, around September, of interviewing 10,000 youth around the world and looking at their eco-anxiety and their eco-grief, and really showed how pervasive it really is. So I've been suggesting a different definition of emotional resiliency than what is the more conventional way of thinking about it. So if you looked it up online, you'd see emotional resiliency is the ability to bounce back from a stressful situation. You know, you're doing whatever you're doing in your life, something derails you, how quickly can you get back? But I think because climate change and perhaps with some of these other concurrent crises, the idea of going back doesn't make as much sense, right? We know with climate change that we're on this escalating trajectory where there is going to be heightened levels of difficulty, more challenges. So I like to say that emotional resiliency is cultivating the ability to remain present, open-minded, and empathetic in the face of increasing stress, the ability to bear witness to and be with more. And if you go back to thinking about that chart of the zone of resilience, the invitation here is that we all do things that can increase our zone of resilience. I love sharing this little bit of science. I have this strange fascination with the brain, but anyway, I recently came across this theory called polyvagal theory, and it really was putting a biological backdrop to the ways that our feelings are contagious. And, you know, think about this. Let's say you're talking with a group of friends and somebody enters the room and joins the group who's just highly agitated, angry, upset about something. It's really easy to feel how the whole tone of the group changes, that those feelings start to ripple throughout the group, right? Or maybe you have just a really great friend that it doesn't matter where you go or what you do, when you're together, it's just you always feel good, you feel at home in yourself. And what they're finding is that the level of influence we have on each other is happening at the level of the nervous system, that our nervous systems start to attune to each other. So that if you're with someone who's really grounded, present, calm, your own shoulders kind of drop down a little bit. And I like to remind people of this or share this because there's still, you know, a little bit of, is it okay if I do self-care? You know, that I step away and attend to myself when there's such a large global need. But the truth is that self-care can be and is community care when we re-enter, because how we are is becomes as important as what we do or say. It's very influential. And to know that it's part of this significant positive change that we're all working for and wanting a safer and healthier world. So I'm not going to talk too much about this, but in shining a light on some of the limitations of our minds is also a suggestion to get curious about other ways of knowing. We've been talking a lot about sort of our emotional intelligence, our emotional landscape. But it comes in, you know, through these sort of what I would call these different portals, these different openings, what creativity can bring us, intuition as a way of knowing, what we can learn collectively, because as I was just talking about, our nervous systems are communicating with each other, kind of reminds me of what they know about the roots of trees and what's happening below the surface of the soil. You know, there's ways we can tune into our body and have a different understanding than what gets downloaded from our head. And ancestral wisdom that we can have access to. And of course, nature-based. Okay, so I'm gonna stop my share here and just open things up.